session of this conference called Let's Go. I want to share just a little short bio about Dr. G. Dr. Gordon MacDonald, he's been a pastor, author for way over 50 years. He's been in ministry probably over 60 years. Dr. MacDonald has brought years of experience to pastors all throughout the globe. It's been absolutely incredible. He's been a great friend, a coach to me. Many years he pastored Grace Chapel in Lexington, where he's still the pastor emeritus there. He's also very influential in Christian Fellowship, where he served for president for many years. Also, he was a part of World Relief, and then also helping many different types of leaders. But one of my favorite things about him is he's just so humble. And Dr. Gordon has some best-selling books, including Ordering Your Private World. And now this, I think, I don't know if this is the first copy, but I definitely have one. This is way before Thomas Nelson. This was a joint effort. This is like in 86, 87. It's all marked up. It's awesome, but I think there's an updated copy since then. Also, another great book that I personally love is A Resilient Life. And then another awesome book is Going Deep. And then, of course, you know, Who Stole My Pulpit? And these are all books you should have in your library. I am just so thankful for Dr. MacDonald's influence all throughout the world. And so welcome, Dr. Gordon. So great to have you here today. How are you?
I'm fine, Gary. Thank you for those very kind words. Those are very nice things you said. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, it's amazing to have you. We're going to be closing out this session with you. And so, you know, this season has definitely been tough with the continual pivoting and the acceleration and the adjustment and realigning and revitalizing things. And, you know, many people right now are feeling tired. Their soul is tired. And so you are just such an incredible leader in this area to navigate and to help us through these tough waters. Now, I know our audience today is so thankful to have you here. And so we are dying to hear these nuggets of wisdom that all through these years that you're going to share with us. So I'm going to turn it right over to you, Dr. Gordon, and just let you just lead us. So get your pens and papers out. This is going to be awesome.
Thank you, Gary. Again, thank you for the kind introduction, and it's a privilege to be with you all. It's not often that I get to speak to an exclusively Baptist group these days, but I am one of you. I was raised the son of a Baptist pastor, and I've enjoyed the Baptist ministry over the years, so it's nice to be with all of you. I'm 81 years of age. And one of the things that has fascinated me as I've observed myself growing up through the years is that this is a time in my life when I look backwards and ask, how did God get me here? What were the different procedures? Where did I hear the voice of God and make right turns and left turns, right turns and wrong turns? How did it all work? And one of the things that impresses me is that God has powerfully spoken to me, not just through scripture and through the dynamics and beauty of creation, but down through the years, there's been a train of people who have walked alongside of me and have been God's voice very richly in my life. It's an exercise that's one of these days each of you want to do, if you've not done already, to ask yourself, how has God spoken into my life? And when he used other people, what was it he said to me through them? I imagine that if we took this seriously, we probably could come up with a list of hundreds of people who have touched us over the years, walked with us, and somehow made a big difference. In my study of these people who have made such a challenge in my life, I tried to narrow them down to 8 or 9 or 10 people. Who were the top 9, 10 people that God used over these years to take me through life as a father, a husband, as a pastor, and the other things which I got to do. And I came up with a list of 9, and I want to tell you about them because I think it's one of the most important things that we're going to be facing in the next years as we rebuild church ministry after this pandemic. How does God use people in the lives of others? There was a great Jewish theologian in the 1900s by the name of Abraham Joshua Heschel. He died in 1974. And he's really worth reading for people who like serious Jewish theology. But one of the things that caught my interest one day in Heschel's writings was this word. He said, what we need in this world is not a lot more textbooks, but we need text people. And that's a very Jewish thought because it comes out of Jewish antiquity before the days that the average person was even able to read, much less have printed material. Training, discipleship was all done through other people. And I wonder if the church that's going to emerge out of this period of time is going to refire on that idea that how do you train people to train people? Let me tell you, as I look through the scriptures, I see that there's a whole series of people who were trainers one of the other. Moses trains Joshua. Mordecai trains Esther. Elijah trains Elisha. Elizabeth, during Mary's pregnancy with our Lord, has a time with her in the home and trains her. Barnabas trains Paul of Tarsus. Paul trains Timothy. And Jesus, of course, in the most famous transactions, is the trainer of the 12. But you know, my favorite story in all the Bible is the story of Eli and Samuel. I just chuckle each time I read that as Samuel wakes up in the night and he hears these strange noises, rushes to Eli's bed. Eli sends him back to bed 3 times saying, I'm not calling you. And then finally, Eli, as the superior in the group, realizes God is in motion here. And he's challenging a young boy to be the next great prophet in Israel. And so when Samuel comes back to Eli's room for the 3rd or 4th time, Eli says to him, you know, what may be going on here is God is speaking to you. And if you hear God speaking again, this is how you should answer. Say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. That's one of the great little stories of all the Bible. And it's, I think, one of the great dramas that all of us are involved in as we try to help people hear and decode the voice of God and then respond to it. Let me tell you about some of the people God used to speak into my life and help me to go deeper in each section that we all live as we go through 70 or 80 years of life. The first person God used to speak into my life came when I was only a 4 or 5-year-old child. Her name was Miss McCall. She lived in our area, and every Wednesday, she invited a small group of children to come to her home for cookies and milk. And then she would regale us with a Bible story and a missionary story. Every week, it was a new story. When I was 4, 5, 6 years of age, I got used to every Wednesday going to Miss McCall's house to hear these stories. And she was absolutely the most gifted storyteller you could ever imagine. When she told the story of Moses and the burning bush, you smelt the fire, you heard it crackling, you heard the deep voice of God. She knew how to ignite the imagination. Or if she told the story of David and Goliath, you would see those 5 smooth stones that David collected to put into his slingshot. Or if she told the story of Jesus and the disciples in the storm, you could feel that boat rocking, you could feel the fear of the disciples. Everything came alive when Miss McCall told a story. You know, to this day, and now we're talking 75 years since then, I know more about the Bible's content in terms of its stories through Miss McCall than any other point in my life. She gave me a love for the Bible stories, and my faith became a faith built on the stories of the Old and the New Testament. She was a person that God used to speak to me. The next person that came into my life was my grandmother. She was a strange woman to a lot of people because she didn't quite fit the mold of a lot of fundamentalist Christians in those days. For example, when I was with my grandmother and she lived in Brooklyn, New York, she would always plan a day where in the morning we would have a reading of the Bible and we would pray for missionaries. And then she would take me to New York City, to Manhattan. She showed me museums, skyscrapers, parks, great manufacturing places, the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building. And I can remember her saying over and over again, son, always look for the beautiful things that God has put into this world. Look at the architecture. Look at the art in the museums. See the shape of things, the beauty, the color of things. Because God's at work and he's saying something to you through beautiful things. I've not met many people in my tradition who were really taught a theology of beauty, but my grandmother was very serious in teaching me in those days to use my curiosity and love the world that God had made. My grandfather was the director of a European missionary organization. And this was during World War II. And so when I was at Grandma's house, she would take out a map of Europe each time, and we would pore over the countries of Europe that were at war, the cities, the language groups, the rivers, all the cultures. By the time I was 5 or 6 years of age, I knew Europe like the back of my hand. But most importantly, she would say during those times to me, son, even as we're sitting here, the children of Europe are perishing. They've lost their parents. Their homes have been destroyed. They don't eat very well. Many of them are starving to death or succumbing to disease. You must always pray for the children of Europe. And then she would lead me, and for the next 15 or 20 minutes, we would pray for the children of Europe. Now today, 75 years later, I go to Germany quite frequently. And each time I'm there in one of those meetings, I will say to people, how many of you around my age were affected by the war? And people would raise their hands all over the hall each time I asked that question. I would tell them what I've just told you about my grandmother teaching me to pray for the children of Europe. And then I would say, I want you to know 75 years ago when you were in real trouble, I prayed for you every day. It's interesting, to this day, you could see the tears come down the cheeks of people, the old people who remember those days with such horror. And for us to make our connection with each other by my saying to them, I was taught how to pray for you. And it's made quite a bond over the years. So I thank my grandmother who showed me the world, who taught me to discover the glory of God in the things of art and others that were made, and a grandmother who taught me to pray for people of other nations and cultures. The third person who walked with me and helped me to hear God's voice was my track coach when I was in high school. He was a godly man. He was also a very good coach. And he took me on and said, I think we could make a runner out of you, Gordon. If you're willing to trust me, if you're willing to push yourself, if you're willing to withstand the pain that comes with fatigue, we can make a winning runner out of you. Each day I would come down to the track ready for a workout, dreading, because this coach often said, I want to make the practices painful so that the race will be a pleasure. That became a character formation statement to me. And all the way through my life, I've regarded that as an important understanding. Make the practices painful, and then the race will be pleasurable. My coach taught me discipline. He was the one who taught me how every day to take the hard things and do them, finish them, pursue excellence, shape them, because as he would say, if God ever calls you into a way of serving him, he will expect you to be a disciplined man all the way through your life. My track coach has been dead for many, many years, but you know something? I still hear him in the back of my head. He speaks quite frequently in ways that I don't fully understand, but I can hear his voice. Don't quit, Gordy. Trust me. I know what's best for you. We will make a great runner out of you. That voice is there even in my 81st year of life. The fourth person who made a great dent in my life and shaped me came in my early 20s. He was a single man. He was a Baptist pastor. And when my family broke up in a sad divorce, he invited me to come and live in his home with him. And I rented a room while I went to college. He said to me when I moved into his home, "Now you need to know I'm not offering you just a bed and breakfast, but I intend that you will grow to be a man of God while you're in this home. So I'm going to be pushing you every day about what it means to reflect Jesus and to walk with him." And did he ever mean that? I can hear him saying to this day, "Gordon, a man who loves Jesus always pays his bills on time," because I wasn't very good at that. "A man who loves Jesus will always make sure that he leaves the bathroom better than when he found it. A man who loves Jesus will always treat women with respect and honor. A man who loves Jesus will find time every day to spend experiences in the scriptures and to be on his knees and to praying up to heaven. A man who loves Jesus will be listening for Jesus's voice every day and how to respond to him." I hear that man all the time over these years. He was God's voice to me during my college years. And a lot of what I became literally was just copied by the way I saw this man living. Not far behind him was another, actually two people, who showed me God's voice in the way they did things. They were a Presbyterian pastor and his wife who lived down the street from where I was going to school. They invited me there one night to their home for dinner. I looked forward to it because as a college student, I have to admit I wasn't eating very well. So an invitation to a private home was a real deal. But what's interesting is that as I sat at their table that night and I ate this wonderful food, something else took precedence. I watched the way this woman treated her husband and the way this man treated his wife. I watched the way they talked to each other. They laughed. They told each other serious stories. They encouraged one another. It was amazing to me. I had never seen anything like that because I grew up in a home where I had a very unhappy father and mother who didn't like their marriage at all. So I'd never really seen how a man and a woman could live together and bring out the best in each other until that evening. And they started inviting me back to their table on many evenings. And I would go just to watch them, to see how they would encourage each other on this particular day. I was so moved by the way they touched each other with affection, the way they would express courage for each other, the way they would answer each other's questions. This went on week after week, month after month. And I remember one night walking home saying to myself, if God ever gives me a woman to marry, I want a woman just like Helen is. And if God allows me to marry, I want to be a husband like Frank is. If God allows me to be married, I want to have a marriage like Frank and Helen did. And all the way through my life, my marriage has been built on the model of Frank and Helen Moss, who taught me simply by modeling in their home the ways of Jesus in relationship. I'm reminded of Aquila and Priscilla, who brought Apollos into their home. And I feel like I understand some of the dynamic that went on in that particular arrangement. Behind Frank and Helen were a series of men who taught me godliness through pain. I call them the rebukers. One of them was a leader of a Christian organization. And one day we were walking along having a conversation, and the name of a third party came up who was not present. And instinctively, as a young man might do, I said something very mean about that person. It shouldn't have been said. I will never forget how this man turned to me. He put his face about 12 inches away from mine, and he said with a very determined voice, "Gordon, a man who says he loves Jesus would never speak that way about another person." It was as if he stuck a knife into my ribs. It was an embarrassing moment. It was a humiliating moment. It was a painful moment. But it was a God moment. He had said something to me 45 years ago that to this day lives right up on my tongue. And anytime to this day, I feel the impulse to say something about anybody in politics, in show business, in the church, I hear that rebuke from 45 years ago. A man who loves Jesus would not talk that way about another person. That's a sound biblical rebuke, and I've had any number of them over the years by women and men who cared enough for me to speak truth into my life and to arrest those places that really could have gotten out of shape and balance if I hadn't listened. I look back and thank God for my rebukers. They taught me as much about the Christian life as anybody who ever came along. Then there was the president of our seminary, Dr. Vernon Grounds, out in Denver. He was really my surrogate father. He was somebody who really believed in my future. He was a lovely, godly man, and we would have breakfast together quite often, and he would ask me questions. He would draw me out. I said to him one day, Dr. Grounds, what's one of the most important principles I can learn as a pastor as I walk with you? He said, always be a master of the questions. You're going to discover that very few people know how to do surgery on the heart of the people around them. Surgery is done by asking good questions, getting people to feel safe as you dig into their heart and find the truths beneath the surface of their lives. I watched him ask questions of students, of faculty at the school, of other people who came to see him. And I realized that he was a master at getting below the surface and creating conversation that was healing and challenging and loving. And I determined a long time ago, I was going to acquire that strength. It's been one of the most important things I've learned over my years, to make sure that I never leave a person alone without having asked a question or two that shows deep and rich concern, not for the surface of their lives, but for the interiority of their lives. I am so thankful to have learned from a good question asker how much a part of ministry that all is. The last person I'd like to tell you about that made a big difference as the voice of God in my life, maybe she won't surprise you, but it's my wife, Gail. I told you about my friend Keith that I shared a home with for a while. Keith said to me one night, Gordon, I've met a woman that I think would make you a wonderful wife. You've got to meet her. The next day he arranged a meeting and I met Gail. 4 weeks later, we were engaged. 4 months later, we walked the aisle of her home church and were married. I can't tell you how many different ways God has used Gail to speak into my life. 2 weeks before the wedding, my friend Keith took me out to lunch. I could see that he was a little bit concerned about something. We ordered our food and then he looked at me and he said, Gordon, I have something very serious to say to you. He said, as I've gotten to know you, I've known that there are some things you haven't learned well yet. Now you're about to marry a woman who is God's gift to you. He means to say many things through you, he means to say many things through her that you need to hear. And then suddenly he put his finger across the table like this, almost at my nose. And he said with a very firm and somewhat loud voice, 3 times, listen to her, listen to her, listen to her. You need to do that because you're not a good listener. I've been listening to Gail now for 59 years. I've learned over and over and over again, when Gail has something deep and serious to say, I better assume that it came from heaven and that God was using her to speak to me. About a month before we were married, Gail heard me preach for the first time. I was invited to visit a church on Wednesday night for about 50 people sitting in the auditorium, and I tried as a 23-year-old to do my best at a preached sermon. Gail sat in the front row with her Bible on her knee and a notebook taking notes on everything I had to say that night. I have no idea what I said. I shall never forget at the end of the evening when the sermon was preached and all the people exited from the hall, there was just Gail and me. And I can see her even in my mind as I describe it to you. She came walking toward me. And when she reached where I was standing, she threw her arms around my neck and kissed me. And then she said, God has given to me a vision tonight of the preacher he wants to make you into over the next years. And I want you to know that I will be there at your side to support you in any possible way. I will be the prayer. I will give you critique if you want it. I will help you do some studying, but I'll always be there as you become the preacher God wants you to be. That kiss, those words made me a preacher. I don't know whether I would have ever had the opportunities to preach to the congregations I preached if it hadn't been for the comments Gail made that night and the way she followed through so faithfully on her promise in the years to come. Over the years, Gail's had a lot of things to speak into my voice: rebukes, corrections, affirmations, suggestions, observations. And little bit by little, I learned over the years how to listen. Well, there's 9 or 10 people, and they are the people who down through the years, in one way or the other, spoke in favor and spoke on behalf of God into my life and made sure that I took the right turn at the right moment. There was Miss McCall, who told stories. There was my grandmother, who showed me what the larger world looked like. There was my track coach that taught me discipline. There was my friend Keith, who taught me how to be a man of character. There were those who rebuked me when I needed to be shown that I was going in the wrong way. There was the couple that invited me to their table and showed me what real marital love could look like. There was Dr. Grounds, who showed me how to ask questions and get into the life of people. And there's been Gail over the years, and she's still doing it, who was making sure that each day I've tried hard to be faithful to the Lord. I'm very grateful for those 9 people. If any one of them had dropped out, I might not be on the screen with you this morning. My hope is that as each of you enter into ministry day after day, especially in this difficult time, you see the importance of training and discipleship, mentoring, both to give it to younger people who are coming along and making sure that you have a mentor or 2 by your side to help you see yourself as God sees you. God speaks through scriptures. God speaks through creation. God spoke to us through his son, Jesus. God speaks to us through the traditions of the church. God speaks through mentors. And I'm very grateful to have had a few good ones down through the years. So that's my word to you at the end of this morning. Maybe I've said something, maybe I used a word, maybe there was a phrase you heard, and it provokes a question in your heart, something you'd like to enlarge upon. And I'll sit here and listen and respond in the best way I can. Gary, it's all yours.
Wow, that was absolutely amazing. Every time you talk, I think Joe Souza and I talked probably a couple of months ago. They said every time Dr. Gordon speaks, we're like hanging off our chair, and it's like collecting like nuggets of things that we're just applying to our life. And so there was a lot here. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, if you definitely have any questions, go on and put those up in the chat. I have a question for you, Dr. G. Right now, you talked about asking questions, and that was one of the things I've learned off of you is to constantly ask and listen and to hear and rest. And so my question to you is, what are the questions that you are asking right now at your age?
At my age.
At your age.
That turns the question a little bit.
Yes.
Well, I think you have to understand that as we walk through the decades of our lives, the questions change from decade to decade. If you're talking to men and women in their 20s, for example, you're going to be talking about what they want to do with their lives. You might even, if you feel safe about it, be asking them, who do you want to do these things with? Which leads, of course, to stories about intentions of marriage and whatever. But 20-something people want to talk about vision and possibility. 30 people want to talk about questions that have to do with organizing their life and streamlining it so it's most effective. People in their 30s are often looking back and saying, did I make good choices 20 years ago when I started all of this? How am I doing? Why are there people doing better than me? What do I have to learn? What do I have to regret? 50-something people are asking the question, how do I reform my life as I move into the second half of what I'm doing or being? 60s are people asking, how long can I keep on doing the things that I'm doing? And when do I have to lay it down? 70s people are asking questions around loss. My friends are moving away, they're dying. They're dropping out of life in one way or the other. What do I do with the loneliness that I'm beginning to feel? And of course, 80s people are living with end of life issues. At my age, I think about dying almost every day. I don't mind the thought of dying, but some of the ways you might die don't sound very attractive to me. So I think about dying. Gail and I talk about what would happen if one of us leaves the other. And then that always leads toward questions of eternal life and heaven. What do I know about heaven? What will we do there? What can we look forward to? So those are the question bases that often start. Or if someone's telling you something that's painful in their lives, you want to descend as quick as you can do to feelings. What's God saying to you? What are the great issues that are raised with that kind of thing? So this whole notion of questions has to be asked very, very perceptively as to where people are coming from and what they're willing to hear from you.
Wow, excellent. So again, if you have a question, I'm going to put a question from Joe Souza. How can we as Christian leaders be a voice of hope to the hopeless generation in the midst of this pandemic? Great question, Joe.
Well, of course, if you're a pastor or any kind of leader that has a voice into a group, you want to make sure that your sermons or your talks or Bible studies have a hope element into them. You want to be watching how people are talking. Are there people that you're seeing who are feeling hopeless and need someone to come alongside? But hope probably is the first great theme that we have to speak to. The other, though, is the word of opportunity. I was talking with Sandy just a little while ago, and we were talking about the fact that when the church comes out of this period of a pandemic, it will not go back to the old ways. There's going to be totally different ways of doing church. This is a time during the pandemic for good men and women to sit together and have long conversations about where the church might be going in the next days. What are some of the fresh themes in theology that need to be rehearsed again that maybe we've forgotten about a little bit? So I want to know, what is the church going to look like, and what contribution will it make into people's lives a year from now?
That's excellent. So if you have a question, put it in the chat box. I have another question. I love asking questions. That's how I learn. What are the voices, or who are the voices right now that you're listening to that's bringing you hope?
Boy, I'm struggling to find a lot of voices. I think our movement, our evangelical movement, this is probably not where you want to take this question, but I'll throw it in because I'm started. This has not been a good time for evangelical leadership. Our voice, I think, has been dimmed by other voices to a considerable extent. And I'm hoping that from the younger generations of men and women who are coming up through the life of the church, that we're going to hear some fresh themes and fresh ideas that my generation has forgotten, perhaps. I love to listen to Tim Keller. Tim and I have been friends in the past. When I was a pastor in New York City, we were in the same apartment building. So I love to listen to Tim as a modern thinker. I love the works of, uh, my mind just blanked out, uh, our wonderful theologian from England. I'll think about it after we're off the line,
Okay.
but I also have, at my age, have broadened my reading a little bit. I love to read the works of the Quakers, because I think they bring to our understanding of God's world some things that we Baptists have ignored over the last many years. So I read a lot of Quaker theology and recommend it. Uh, that's as far as I can go right now.
Okay. We have a question from Phil Hardwick. He says, what are some of your spiritual practices these days that you find most helpful? Great question, Phil.
In our older years, Gail and I find it very easy to get up early in the morning. We're generally up and walking around by 4:40 or 4:45. And so the general principle around our home is that the first hour, hour and a half is quiet time, where Gail goes to her little office and I go to mine. And the first thing we almost always do is that we journal. We've been keeping journals ever since the year 1968, which, we've got hundreds of journals now, and we don't know what we're going to do with them when it comes time, when we can't write anymore. But both of us have found that writing in the journal each day has enhanced our spiritual direction. It's a place where we can write about our feelings, about things that we're concerned about, hopes and dreams we have, things that we're getting out of the reading we're doing, things we've done together, a little bit of history, a little bit about our grandchildren. So the journal becomes the best friend, if you please, the one that we talk to first in the morning. We both are average readers, so we take some time in the morning to read from substantial literature that will nurse and fill our souls. We both try to spend time in intercession each day for the pastors that we're counseling with and mentoring. We obviously pray for our own family, but those are the key things. And then to take time for exercising. I walk about 3.5 miles every day to make sure that my body keeps well tuned and my weight's down. But that's our kind of our little devotional hour in the morning. That's very, very important to us. And uh, I can't tell you how important that is, especially in the second half of life, when you really get down to some serious issues. And so our morning quiet times, quiet periods are very, very important to us.
Great. Thank you so much. Another question came in is, how do we encourage and promote for the younger generation, our kids, our grandkids, that kind of convince them they need a mentor in their life? And they tend to be more focused on social media rather than personal relationships. So what may be some rudders we can use for our grandkids or the younger generation to kind of get in their lives a little bit?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that I can adequately answer it. For me, having mentors or coaches in my life was very, very natural from the earliest days. I mean, I told you about Miss McCall. I wanted to know that woman. She aroused my curiosity. I loved being with my grandmother, and something that drove it for me was the unhappiness of my own home. This is a terrible thing to say, but I was happiest when I was away from my home. So I was always seeking out adults, men and women and couples, even in my childhood years, that I could spend time with and have conversations with, because there was something about my home that was seriously lacking. So that's one of the reasons I'm so enthusiastic about the mentoring component that should be in the church, because you need more than your father and mother, even if they are the happiest married couple in town. Robert Bly, the poet, once said, the best gift a father and mother can give to their children is to introduce them to their friends. And I would say that in one way or the other, that was true in my own life. I built a lot of adult friendships through my teen years and my early 20s, people I could turn to. Um, I don't think young people in this day have done that very well, but the pandemic may, on the other hand, be driving young people toward adults. This is a scary time for us all. And so young people want to know from older people, what do you know that I don't know? So it may be a time for churches to take advantage of the whole notion of training. I like to say to pastors, and I surprise them a little bit, um, Pastor, preaching may not be your number one job. Your number one job probably is training people. Maybe preaching is number two, but it's not number one. If you want to leave a strong church for years to come, you will you will invest yourself in those people, those men and women who are open to being mentored and trained. That's the most important thing a church can do these days.
Wow, thank you so much. Well, that's the last question. We seem to be out of time. And so Dr. Gordon MacDonald, thank you so much for these great words of wisdom and being part of the Let's Go conference. Thank you so much for being here.